Welcome to our Top 10 Videos channel. This video is about the top 10 best places to be during the pandemic in 2021. This is what Bloomberg said January 25, 2021. People are finally getting shots, but the biggest global vaccination campaign in living memory has yet to reach a point where it's causing meaningful shifts in Bloomberg's COVID Resilience Ranking, a measure of the best places to be in the coronavirus era. Each month, we crunch the numbers to get a snapshot of where the pandemic is being handled the most effectively, with the least social and economic disruption. Top performers like New Zealand, Australia and Taiwan haven't been hurt by the fact they've not yet started vaccinating their populations, as low community transmission and balmy weather helps maintain their COVID edge. According to Bloomberg, the top 10 of best places to be in COVID goes like this. Number 10. Vietnam. With a resilience score of 63 and 0 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 0 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 21% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 9. Hong Kong. With a resilience score of 63.5 and 21 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 22 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 155% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 8. Japan. With a resilience score of 63.6 and 119 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 40 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 120% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 7. Finland. With a resilience score of 64.5 and 142 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 116 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 183% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 6. Norway. With a resilience score of 64.5 and 274 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 100 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 183% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 5. China. With a resilience score of 66.3 and 0 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 3 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 77% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 4. Taiwan. With a resilience score of 70.1 and 0 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 0 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 26% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 3. Australia. With a resilience score of 70.9 and 2 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 36 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 230% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. Number 2. Singapore. With a resilience score of 71.3 and 13 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 5 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 85% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. And finally, number 1. New Zealand. With a resilience score of 76.8 and 3 cases per 100,000 people on the last month. 5 COVID deaths per 1 million people since the start of the pandemic, and 247% of the population covered by vaccine supply agreements. In January, New Zealand, with its closed borders, 4 vaccine deals and near elimination of the virus locally, holds onto pole position for the 3rd month running, while Mexico remains at number 53, the last of the ranked economies, as fatalities reach a record high. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said on Jan. 24 that he's contracted COVID-19. Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which lead the world in inoculating against COVID-19, have been propelled into the top 15 due to the fast pace of rollouts, with as many as 40 doses given out per 100 people. But their boosts, Israel rose 2 rungs to 15th, were partially erased as infections continued to surge. The US rises 2 spots to 35th, boosted by a vaccination program that new President Joe Biden has pledged to accelerate. Its death toll remains the worst in the world, topping 400,000 in January. The UK was the first Western country to give emergency authorizations to the Pfizer Incorporated BioNTech SE and the AstraZeneca plc Oxford University shots, but a more transmissible virus mutation sweeping the nation impacted its rank, dropping it 2 spots to 32nd. The ranking scores economies of more than $200 billion on 10 core metrics. From growth in virus cases to the overall mortality rate and testing capabilities, the capacity of the local healthcare system, the impact of virus-related restrictions like lockdowns on the economy, and freedom of movement are also taken into account. In January, Bloomberg introduced an 11th indicator to reflect progress on getting COVID shots and arms, and the GDP growth forecast indicator was updated to show projections for 2021 instead of 2020. How quickly vaccinations can bring down fatalities and how effective they'll be against new fast-spreading variants will be the key focus into February when we'll update the COVID resilience ranking again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more valuable content.